There has never been anyone like him, not before him and not since. This is not hyperbole. It is not the kind of inflated reverence that accumulates around famous people after they die, softening their edges and erasing their complications in the warm light of nostalgia. It is a fact that virtually every serious musicologist, choreographer, cultural historian, and entertainment professional who has examined his work has arrived at independently and stated publicly, Michael Jackson was the most complete popular entertainer in the history of recorded music. The voice, the dancing, the songwriting, the production, the spectacle, the capacity to make millions of people simultaneously feel something so specific and so personal that they believed, each of them individually, that the music had been made for them alone. That completeness, the specific combination of gifts deployed at a level of technical mastery that each of them individually had never coexisted in the same person, is real and is documented and is not in serious dispute by anyone who has examined the record honestly. And then consider what was done to him, not by his enemies, not by the press, though the press did considerable damage, not even entirely by the people around him, though they played their roles. Consider what was done to him by the world that claimed to love him, the world that consumed him from the time he was 5 years old, that took from him every ordinary thing that human development requires. That made him into something that existed for other people's pleasure. And then when the something it had made became strange and troubled and difficult to look at without discomfort, turned on him with a ferocity that it reserved specifically and particularly for the people it had loved most completely. This video is not a defense of Michael Jackson. It is not an attack on him either. It is something harder than both of those things. It is an attempt to see him clearly, to follow the line from the boy in Gary, Indiana, to the man in the Neverland Ranch, and to understand how one becomes the other. Here is what is actually at stake in examining this story carefully and completely. The Michael Jackson story is a story of what happens when a system, the entertainment industry's commercial machinery, combined with the specific legal and cultural frameworks within which it operated, extracts the maximum possible value from a person over the maximum possible period without ever being required to account for the human cost of the extraction. That story is not unique to Michael Jackson. The entertainment industry has been producing versions of it for as long as the entertainment industry has existed. What is unique to Michael Jackson is the scale of the talent, the scale of the commercial consumption, the scale of the eventual public destruction, and the scale of the silence about what the system was doing while it was doing it. Understanding that story, not the scandal story, not the tabloid story, but the system story, is what this video is organized around. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29th, 1958 in Gary, Indiana, the seventh of 9 children in a household that was, depending on which account you consult, either a breeding ground for extraordinary talent or a site of sustained psychological damage, or, most accurately, both of those things simultaneously. His father, Joseph Walter Jackson, is one of the most complicated figures in the history of American popular music. A man of genuine musical ambition who had watched his own dreams of a professional career dissolve into the ordinary demands of life in an industrial city, Joseph Jackson looked at his children and saw, with a clarity that was also a kind of violence, the opportunity that he himself had never had. He used a belt, he used fear, he called Michael ugly, he mocked his nose in front of other people. He made a boy who was already hypersensitive to the point of psychological fragility understand early and often and without ambiguity that his value was located entirely in his performance. Michael Jackson spoke about his father throughout his adult life with a striking consistency. He said Joseph never hugged him. He said he would become physically ill before performances as a child because the fear of failing his father was so acute that his body treated it as a physical threat. He said he could never call him Dad, only Joseph, a formality that said everything about the emotional architecture of their relationship. And then in the same interviews, he would say that he loved his father, that he understood him, that he forgave him. The coexistence of those two things, the precise description of damage and the insistence on love, ran through everything he did for the rest of his life. The Jackson 5 were performing in clubs and talent shows across the Midwest by the time Michael was 6 years old. By the accounts of people who saw those early performances, the experience of watching young Michael Jackson was genuinely disorienting. Children of 6 do not move the way he moved. They do not command a stage the way he commanded it. They do not possess the instinctive understanding of a room, of an audience, of the precise moment when a performance tips from competent into transcendent. People who witnessed those early performances consistently reach for the same word, impossible. He was signed to Motown Records in 1969. He was 10 years old, and from that moment forward, he belonged, in a very real and very consequential sense, to something larger than himself, to his family, to his father, to an industry, to an audience. The childhood that other children have, the unstructured time, the boredom, the gradual and protected development of an internal life, the experience of being nobody in particular for long enough to understand who you actually are, that childhood was over before it had ever really started. Michael Jackson would spend the next 40 years trying to recover it. And the world that had taken it from him would watch that attempt with a mixture of fascination and cruelty that it never once examined honestly. Off the Wall in 1979, produced with Quincy Jones, announced to anyone paying attention that what was happening here was not a child star extending his shelf life. It was an artist arriving. And then came Thriller. It is difficult to convey what it felt like to be alive and paying attention to popular music when Thriller was released in 1982. The album sold over 66 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling album in history by a margin that no subsequent release has approached. It produced 7 top 10 singles from a single album, a record that had never been achieved before and has not been matched since. But the number that mattered most in terms of understanding what Michael Jackson was and what he was doing was not the sales figure. It was the demographic breakdown of who was buying the album. Thriller sold across every racial demographic in America in a way that no black artist's record had ever done before. It sold to white suburban teenagers and to black urban communities and to middle-aged listeners who had never bought a pop record in their lives, not because it was calculated to be inoffensive, but because Michael Jackson had found inside the specific combination of his voice and his production and his physical presence, a frequency that something in the human nervous system simply could not resist. The television performance of Billie Jean at the Motown 25 celebration in 1983, during which Michael Jackson performed the moonwalk for a national television audience for the first time, is one of the most analyzed 30-second sequences in the history of performance. What is interesting about all that analysis is that it almost always arrives at the same conclusion. The moonwalk itself, as a technical movement, is not the most remarkable thing about those 30 seconds. The most remarkable thing is what his face does while he does it. The expression is not triumph. It is not showmanship. It is something closer to surprise, as if the movement is happening to him rather than being executed by him. This quality, the sense that the performance is arriving from somewhere outside conscious intention, is what made Michael Jackson impossible to imitate. Everyone can learn the steps. Nobody has ever located the place the steps came from. The physical transformation of Michael Jackson is the most publicly documented and most privately misunderstood aspect of his entire story. The images tell a story that is, at first glance, relatively straightforward. A young black man with broad features and dark skin becomes, over roughly 15 years, someone who appears to be a different person entirely. The explanations offered publicly were almost entirely external. He was bleaching his skin deliberately. He was altering himself to look white. He was mentally ill. He was running from his blackness. All of these narratives were applied to him by different people with different agendas, almost always without access to the actual information that would have made any of them accurate. Here is what is known, reported by medical professionals with knowledge of his case and by people close to him. Michael Jackson was diagnosed with vitiligo, a condition that causes the immune system to attack the cells that produce skin pigmentation, resulting in patches of depigmentation that spread unpredictably across the body in the early 1980s. The condition is real, it is documented in his medical records, and it is one that many people with darker skin find particularly distressing because the contrast between pigmented and depigmented areas is far more visible. The decision to use makeup and eventually medication to even out his skin tone was a response to that diagnosis, an attempt to control the appearance of something being done to his body without his permission, rather than an attempt to change his race. He also, unquestionably, had extensive cosmetic surgery. The nose reconstructions are documented and visible across decades of photographs. The reasons he gave in the interviews where he addressed them at all were connected to his father's mockery. Joseph Jackson had called his son's nose ugly from childhood, had used it as a specific and repeated point of humiliation, and the surgery, people who knew Michael suggest, was less about aesthetics in any conventional sense than about an attempt to remove from his face the specific feature that his father had used to diminish him. The household at Neverland Ranch, the private amusement park, the zoo, the elaborate constructed world he had built on a property in the Santa Ynez Valley, was becoming, across the late 1980s and early 1990s, the subject of a kind of cultural unease that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Something about the scale of it, something about the specific nature of the fantasy being constructed. But here is the reading that the cultural conversation almost never applied. Neverland was not a symptom of madness. It was the most honest thing about him. It was a man building, with all the resources available to him, the one thing he had never been given and could never get back: the childhood, the unstructured time, the Ferris wheel, the petting zoo, the movie theater, the specific, elaborate, funded version of the ordinary life that had been taken from him before he understood what it was. Understanding Neverland as pathology requires ignoring what Michael Jackson's actual childhood was. Understanding it as self-revelation requires only following the line from The Boy Signed to Motown at 10 to the man who spent $270 million on a property where children could come and experience the thing he had never had. Stay with me, because what comes next, the accusations, the trials, the years of damage, is a part of this story that has been covered more extensively than almost any other celebrity narrative of the last 30 years. But I am going to tell it differently from the way it's usually told. The first accusation arrived in 1993. Jordan Chandler, a 13-year-old boy whose father had developed a close relationship with Jackson, alleged that Michael Jackson had sexually abused him. The allegation detonated across the global media with an immediacy and a completeness that obliterated everything else. Michael Jackson denied the allegations completely and consistently for the rest of his life. He was never charged criminally in connection with the 1993 case. A civil settlement was reached, approximately $23 million, and the terms of that settlement have been cited ever since by people on both sides as evidence for their position. Those who believe the accusations point to the settlement as an admission of guilt. Those who believe in his innocence point out that settling a civil suit while maintaining criminal innocence is a legal strategy, not a confession, and that Jackson's attorneys advised settlement partly because the civil case, with its lower burden of proof, represented a greater practical risk than the criminal investigation. What is not disputed and what is important to the full story is what that period did to Michael Jackson as a person. People who were close to him during and after 1993 describe a man who was psychologically shattered in a way that was not performance and not calculated for sympathy. He had built his entire identity, whatever remained of it after a childhood spent entirely in public, around the belief that his love for children was the purest thing in his life, the closest thing he had to the uncomplicated childhood he had never been allowed to have. The accusation reached into that specific place and damaged something that never fully recovered. The second accusation came in 2003 when a documentary by journalist Martin Bashir, filmed over months with Jackson's corporation and then edited in ways that Jackson's team argued were fundamentally misleading, provided the context for a new allegation from a boy named Gavin Arvizo. Jackson was charged with multiple counts of child molestation and other crimes. The trial lasted 5 months. In June 2005, the jury acquitted him on all 14 counts. The acquittal did not restore what had been taken. By 2005, Michael Jackson was a man who had been tried twice in the court of public opinion and once in an actual courtroom, and who had been found in the public mind guilty regardless of what the jury said. The industry that had made him had quietly distanced itself. The radio stations that had played his music relentlessly had become more cautious. The cultural space that had been his for 20 years had contracted around him in ways that a verdict could not reverse. He left the United States after the trial and spent several years living primarily in Bahrain, in Ireland, and in Las Vegas, a kind of stateless existence that people who saw him during that period describe as genuinely difficult. He was in chronic physical pain from injuries accumulated over decades of physically demanding performance. He was using prescription medications in quantities and combinations that the people around him found alarming, and he was, by multiple accounts, still dreaming of a return, still believing that the music could fix what had been broken. The This Is It concert series was announced in 2009. 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London. 450,000 tickets gone within minutes of going on sale in what was at that point the fastest selling concert event in history. The rehearsal footage that was released after his death, compiled into the documentary also titled This Is It, shows something that surprised many of the people who watched it. A man who appeared in those rehearsal sessions more alive than he had seemed in years, more present, more engaged. People who were in the room during those rehearsals, dancers, musicians, production staff, have spoken about the experience with a striking consistency. They say the Michael Jackson who showed up to rehearse was closer to the Michael Jackson of the early years than anything they had been prepared to expect. The voice was there, the instincts were there. Whatever had happened to him in the intervening years, the fundamental gift had not gone anywhere. But there are other accounts from people also present during that period who describe a man who was, in the hours and days between rehearsals, in a condition that was the precise opposite of what the stage showed, who was not sleeping, who was dependent on medications being provided in ways that multiple people in his circle found deeply troubling, who was, according to some accounts, expressing private doubts about whether he could physically sustain 50 concerts at the level of performance he had set for himself and that the production required. And here is the last thing, the thing that places the Conrad Murray conviction in its proper and far more disturbing context. Because Murray was one node in a system, and the system was, collectively and in ways that the law found difficult to prosecute, failing the man it was supposed to serve. Conrad Murray was hired as Michael Jackson's personal physician in 2009. He was not a specialist in the medications he was being asked to administer. He was being paid, by accounts from people with knowledge of the financial arrangements, a sum substantially higher than standard medical compensation. A sum that people who have examined the situation suggest created a financial relationship that compromised his medical judgment in ways that had fatal consequences. According to accounts from multiple sources, with proximity to the situation. Accounts that have never been consolidated into a single public narrative, because no single journalist or investigator has had access to all of them simultaneously. There were people in Michael Jackson's professional environment in the spring of 2009 who had significant and specific concerns about his physical and psychological state. Concerns that were raised internally, concerns that were not acted upon in the ways that the people raising them expected or required. The financial stakes of this Is It tour were enormous. The production had been sold, the tickets had been set in motion, and the machine, as machines tend to do when the stakes are high enough, prioritized its own continuation over the well-being of the human being at its center. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. The machine moved on. The estate he left behind was in significant debt at the time of his death. It has since generated hundreds of millions of dollars from his music and his name. The machine that failed to protect him has continued to profit from him. This is not unusual. It is entirely characteristic of the relationship between Michael Jackson and the industry that built him, consumed him, and ultimately outlasted him. He was not a simple person. He was not innocent in every dimension that the word implies, and he was not guilty in every dimension that his accusers claimed. He was a man who had been made into something that no human being is equipped to be, made into it before he was old enough to resist, maintained inside it by a system with every financial incentive to keep him there, and destroyed by it in the end in ways that the system found economically convenient to ignore. Michael Jackson left behind music that will outlast every narrative that has been applied to it. Thriller, Billie Jean, Man in the Mirror, Black or White, Earth Song, Human Nature. These are not simply songs. They are the artifacts of a specific and unrepeatable human consciousness trying, in the only language it ever fully mastered, to communicate something about what it feels like to be alive in a world that wants more from you than you can give and less of you than you actually are. He was a boy from Gary, Indiana, who wanted more than anything, more than the fame and more than the money and more than the record sales, to have the childhood that was taken from him before he understood what it was. The machine took it. The machine profited from the taking, and the machine has never once been required to account for what it did. Michael Joseph Jackson, born August 29th, 1958, died June 25th, 2009. The most gifted, popular entertainer who ever lived. The most consumed. The least protected, and the one whose story, even now, even after everything, we have not yet found the honesty or the courage to tell completely. The Jackson 5 years, from the first Motown recordings in 1969 to the family's departure from the label in 1975, established the commercial infrastructure and the personal dynamics that would shape the rest of Michael Jackson's professional life with a comprehensiveness that the adult solo career is impossible to understand without accounting for. Berry Gordy's Motown Records was, in 1969, the most sophisticated machine for the commercial packaging and deployment of Black American musical talent that the recording industry had ever produced. Its specific achievements, the creation of crossover appeal for Black artists in a mainstream pop market that was not organized around Black artistic expression, were genuine and transformative. Its specific methods, the tight control over image, repertoire, production, and public presentation that the Motown infrastructure required of the artists it signed, were also, for the specific people subject to them at specific stages of their personal development, a form of constraint whose full costs are visible only in retrospect. Michael Jackson entered that machine at the age of 10. He left it as the central commercial asset of the enterprise, rather than as one member of a family group. 17 years later, when his solo stardom had exceeded the machine's capacity to contain or control it. The specific choreographic innovations that Michael Jackson developed across the period from Off the Wall through Thriller, the moonwalk, most famously, but also the specific quality of isolation and weight that his dancing brought to a tradition of black popular dance that had been evolving since the 1950s, are innovations whose relationship to the history of the form is sometimes obscured by the celebrity mythology that surrounds them. The moonwalk, which Jackson performed publicly for the first time at the Motown 25 television special in March 1983, was not invented by him. The sliding backward walking motion had antecedents in the work of Jeffrey Daniel and other dancers associated with the electric boogaloo tradition of the 1970s. What Jackson did with it was what he consistently did with the elements of the performance tradition he had absorbed from childhood. He transformed it. He found in the technique a specific quality of physical dissonance, the body moving in a direction opposite to the apparent direction of travel, creating the visual impression of defying the ordinary physical logic of human locomotion. That was both technically extraordinary and emotionally precise in its expressiveness. The moonwalk was not a trick. It was a statement about the relationship between movement and intention, between the body's apparent trajectory and its actual one, that the people who study choreography as a serious art form have spent 4 decades unpacking. The specific legal and commercial architecture of his relationship with the Sony/ATV music publishing catalog, which he purchased in 1985 for $47 million, which included the rights to much of the Beatles catalog and which became one of the most valuable assets in the history of the music publishing industry, is the dimension of his business intelligence that the coverage of his personal difficulties most consistently obscured. Jackson was not simply a commercially successful performer who was managed by other people's business intelligence. He was a person who, with the specific assistance of advisors he chose, and in some cases overruled, made decisions about the ownership and control of intellectual property that the music industry's most experienced practitioners did not consistently make. The catalog acquisition is the most important of those decisions. The decision to purchase, at a price that seemed at the time to many observers to be extravagant, the publishing rights to a body of work whose subsequent commercial value would prove to be multiples of the purchase price. The music business operates on the understanding that the artist generates the value and the rights holder captures it. Michael Jackson decided to be the rights holder. The decision made him, in the specific dimension of intellectual property ownership, one of the most commercially sophisticated participants in the industry's history. The coverage of his life almost never reflected this. The 1993 allegations, the civil lawsuit filed by Jordan Chandler's father, Evan Chandler, the criminal investigation that followed, the decision to settle the civil case for an amount reported to be between $15 and $23 million, are the events that the coverage of his life most consistently treats as either conclusive evidence of guilt or as evidence of a conspiracy organized by a financially motivated family and a sensationalist press, with very little space for the more complicated account that the full evidentiary record examined carefully actually supports. The criminal investigation of 1993 was closed without charges being filed. The 2003 criminal case, which proceeded to trial and produced a verdict of not guilty on all 14 charges, is the legal record that the judicial system produced. Neither the civil settlement, which Jackson's defenders have consistently argued was made for commercial and reputational rather than legal reasons, nor the criminal acquittal settles the underlying questions about what happened or did not happen in those cases. What the questions do, when they are held alongside everything else that is known about who Michael Jackson was and how he'd been formed and what his relationship to childhood and to children meant in the context of his own arrested development, is complicate rather than simplify the already complicated portrait of a person whose life was shaped by extraordinary talent and extraordinary deprivation in proportions that the people who were closest to him. Across multiple phases of his life, described as fundamentally and permanently imbalanced. The specific financial circumstances of his estate at the time of his death, the debts, the unpaid obligations, the evidence of financial management that had not, across the years of his greatest earning potential, organized the available resources in ways that produced the long-term financial security that the resources should have been capable of producing, reflect a dimension of his personal situation that the biographical accounts tend to either minimize or melodramatize. The debts were real. They were, in part, the product of Neverland, of a property whose operating costs were extraordinary and whose value as a commercial asset was complicated by its association with the various legal and reputational difficulties of its owner. They were also, in part, the product of a specific pattern of spending that the people closest to him during the most difficult years describe as the spending of someone who found in the acquisition of objects and experiences a temporary management of something that the objects and experiences could not permanently address. The estate that has since become one of the most commercially valuable in the entertainment industry, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue from the music catalog, the licensing of his name and image, and the commercial management of his posthumous artistic legacy, is the estate that the financial difficulties of his final years did not represent at the time of his death. The machine that extracted value from him during his life has continued to extract value from him after it. The Thriller album is the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. The superlative is worth holding for a moment because the popular tendency to receive extraordinary commercial achievements as simply the quantitative expression of talent at a sufficiently high level tends to obscure the specific combination of factors, some of which had nothing to do with the talent that produced an outcome of this particular magnitude. The talent was necessary but not sufficient. The production partnership with Quincy Jones provided the specific combination of orchestral ambition and pop accessibility that translated the talent into commercial product at the highest level of craft the industry could produce. The MTV revolution provided a new distribution mechanism for the specific combination of voice and movement that Jackson embodied more completely than any other performer of his era. And the specific sociology of the early 1980s pop market, the moment before the fragmentation of audience attention that the subsequent decades would produce, provided the conditions in which all of those elements could combine to produce an outcome that none of them alone could have generated. The specific accounts that the people closest to Michael Jackson in the years between the Thriller peak and the Bad album give of what he was like in private during this period are accounts of a person processing a profound disconnect between what the commercial success had produced and what he had expected it to produce. He had expected that the achievement of sufficient commercial success would generate the experience of having arrived, of having become, through the proof of achievement, the person the achievement was supposed to demonstrate he was. The achievement arrived at a scale that exceeded every expectation. The experience of arrival did not accompany it. The surgeries and the skin transformation and the Neverland and the public persona were all, in some dimension, attempts to manage that disconnect, to build around the self that the success had not transformed, an environment sufficiently controlled and sufficiently organized around his own requirements to substitute for the transformation that success was supposed to have produced. The 1993 allegations, the civil lawsuit, the criminal investigation that followed, the decision to settle the civil case for an amount reported to be between $15 and $23 million, are the events that the coverage of his life most consistently treats as either conclusive evidence of guilt or as evidence of conspiracy. The criminal investigation of 1993 was closed without charges being filed. The 2003 criminal case, which proceeded to trial and produced a verdict of not guilty on all 14 charges, is the legal record that the judicial system produced. Neither outcome settles the underlying questions about what happened or did not happen. What the questions do, when held alongside everything else that is known about who Michael Jackson was and how he had been formed is complicate rather than simplify an already complicated portrait. He was a person whose developmental history had produced specific and documented relationships with childhood that the ordinary social frameworks for evaluating adult behavior around children were not designed to adequately assess. The most honest account of the available evidence is that it is genuinely insufficient in both directions to support the certainty with which the public conversation has consistently delivered its verdicts. The specific trajectory of Michael Jackson's relationship with the press across the 2 decades of his public life between Thriller and his death in 2009 is a relationship whose specific dynamics the coverage itself is poorly positioned to examine, honestly, because the coverage was one of the primary parties to the dynamic it would need to examine. The press that covered his eccentricities was profiting from those eccentricities. The press that covered the allegations was profiting from the controversy the allegations generated. The press that covered his death was profiting from the grief that the death produced in the population that had been formed by his music across 4 decades. The relationship between Michael Jackson and the press was not simply a relationship between a public figure and the institutions responsible for informing the public about public figures. It was a commercial relationship in which his existence, his behavior, his difficulties, and his eventual death were all commercial content whose value the press was continuously harvesting. Understanding this does not resolve the ethical questions his life raises. It does place those questions in the context that the honest examination of any public life requires. The children he left behind, the music he left behind, and the unresolved questions he left behind are the 3 things that Michael Jackson's death produced in proportions that the subsequent 15 years have not resolved into anything more settled than they were in. The days immediately following June 25, 2009, Prince, Paris, and Biggie have lived their adult lives inside the gravitational field of a father whose legacy is simultaneously a gift and an impossible burden. A gift because of what the music represents, what the name carries, what the financial resources make possible, and an impossible burden because the gravitational field of that legacy makes the development of anything genuinely their own, genuinely independent of his, genuinely formed by their own experience rather than by the world's experience of him, extraordinarily difficult. The most honest thing that can be said about what Michael Jackson left behind is that the leaving was not under conditions of his choosing, and that the things left behind, including the people, have continued to be subject to forces that he was unable to control during his lifetime, and that he left no adequate protection against. Subscribe if you didn't know this was the full story behind the death of the most famous entertainer who ever lived, because the single doctor narrative exists to protect a system that was never held accountable. And this channel examines what that system actually did. And if this account of who Michael Jackson really was, the boy from Gary, the machine that consumed him, and the questions that a verdict cannot answer, change the way you understand his life and his music, click the screen right now, because we have other videos featuring famous personalities and their dark secrets and stories that don't usually come to light. If you want to know more, click on our videos and subscribe.